Listen to me. If we stay, we die.
Be strong, brother.
The ocean around the ship had frozen, turning into a thick, motionless mass of leaden color that reflected no light. The heavy tropical air pressed down on the scorching deck, depriving the exhausted men of the chance to take a full, life-saving breath. Captain Luke Collingwood stood by the hot bulwark, staring with a dazed gaze into the lifeless expanse above the endless water. At that moment, he did not yet realize that he was alone. Dirty sails hung limply from the tall masts, resembling the tattered shrouds of long-dead sea giants. The wooden hull of the slowly rotting ship emitted a dull, agonized groan every time a faint ocean swell struck the sides. The merciless heat scorched the last remnants of precious moisture from the deck planks, causing the wood resin to melt and drip down in black, viscous drops. Everything changed in a single second. Just a few weeks ago, the planned route had seemed extremely simple, and a strong tailwind had promised a safe and speedy arrival in Jamaica. Now, however, a fateful navigational error had finally led them into the dead equatorial zone, where there were neither currents nor saving squalls. There was no turning back. The horizon was completely empty, and he knew it. The boundless expanse of water, stretching in all directions to the very edge of the visible world, seemed dead and hostile. Every new mile of this protracted drift now felt like a heavy torture, draining the hidden reserves of the human mind. The sailors on deck moved like translucent shadows. Their movements were frighteningly slow and devoid of any meaning. No one heard his cry. The fresh water supplies in the hold were rapidly evaporating, turning into a thick, putrid sludge at the bottom of the oak barrels. Collingwood methodically inspected the rigging, trying to find even the slightest sign of an approaching weather front or a chance breeze. He still believed this was temporary, but relentless time was already working against him. The unbearable heat seeped under his skin, thickening his blood and tangling his thoughts in the sticky web of encroaching delirium. Every day spent in this endless, watery trap blurred the fine line between strict shipboard discipline and primal chaos. At first, it seemed like an annoying delay, then a death sentence. The stench rising from the overcrowded lower holds mingled with the smell of rotting seaweed, creating a suffocating atmosphere of hopelessness. Down below were hundreds of living people whose very existence now depended entirely on the whims of the absent wind and the decisions of a single man. He was not prepared for what was to come. This was the first day of his true, irreparable ordeal. The sun rose to its zenith every day, turning the deck into a scorching frying pan on which the remnants of humanity were slowly baking. Collingwood clutched the ship's log in his hands, its pages yellowed by acrid salt sweat and constant humidity. He still hoped they were looking for him, but any search in these latitudes had already been called off. The captain turned to his men, whose sunken eyes stared with silent horror at the windless, cruel sky. Each subsequent step across the scorching planks became noticeably harder than the last, sapping the last crumbs of physical strength. He began to realize clearly that no outside help would come. The most terrifying thing at that moment was not the physical pain, but the ringing silence. In September of the year 1781, the port on the island of São Tomé was filled with the familiar bustle of colonial trade. A British ship named the Zong was preparing for a long voyage across the Atlantic, loading its dark holds with living cargo. For Luke Collingwood, this was his first solo voyage as a full-fledged captain, a fact that filled his heart with a grim sense of pride. He did not know that this was only the beginning of the impending disaster. The ship was not originally designed to carry such a large number of people. Its dimensions imposed strict limitations. However, the owner's greed and the new captain's eagerness to prove himself forced the crew to cram more than 400 Africans into the cramped holds. The air in the harbor was thick with the smell of cheap rum, tar, and the inevitable human fear of the unknown. He was left alone with ambitions that would soon become his personal curse. The first weeks of the voyage seemed quite ordinary. The ship cut confidently through the waves, heading for the distant shores of Jamaica. The crew of 17 methodically carried out their duties, monitoring the condition of the sails and the safety of the valuable cargo. The wind was favorable, and Collingwood made optimistic entries in his well-worn logbook every day. At this early stage, everything depended solely on him and his navigational skills. No one on board suspected how fragile the illusion of their complete control over the ocean's fury really was. The holds were a dark, stifling cave where hundreds of chained people breathed the same stale air. Water was rationed strictly according to the norm, but its supplies had originally been calculated for a quicker completion of the dangerous voyage. He did not yet know how many agonizing days he would have to spend in complete psychological isolation. The captain often went down to the lower deck to personally assess the condition of the cargo on which his financial future depended. The suffocating stench of unwashed bodies and excrement forced him to cover his face with a handkerchief soaked in strong vinegar. He viewed these people not as living beings, but solely as numbers on his insurance ledger. From that moment on, he was no longer an explorer of the seas. He had become a cruel overseer. As they ventured deeper into the Atlantic, the sky began to gradually change color, taking on a heavy, leaden hue. The tailwinds grew more capricious, periodically dying down and causing the sails to droop limply on the tall yards. Collingwood consulted the charts more and more frequently, trying to catch the right ocean current leading to the Caribbean islands. None of his maritime instructors had prepared him for the impending nightmare of isolation. Diseases began to spread slowly among the crew and prisoners, reaping their first inevitable harvest in the confined space. Tropical fever and dysentery turned the lower decks into a veritable floating hospital, devoid of medicine and the slightest hope. The bodies of the dead were regularly thrown overboard, and that dull splash became a familiar sound of the evening. He continued to stubbornly press forward, because to stop would mean admitting professional defeat. The water in the barrels began to take on a greenish tint and a distinct bitter taste, indicating the onset of decay. The sailors began to show the first signs of discontent, demanding an increase in the daily ration of fresh drinking water. The captain harshly suppressed any talk of mutiny, threatening the discontented with severe flogging and confinement in the brig. With each passing day, the fragile hope of a quick arrival grew ever thinner and more illusory. At night, Collingwood stood on the bridge, gazing at the stars and trying to find confirmation that his chosen course was correct. He was tormented by vague doubts, but his pride would not allow him to openly admit the possibility of a fatal navigational error. He was not afraid of sudden death from a storm or illness. He was terrified of failing to deliver the cargo and being trampled by the ship owners. The ocean around him continued to live its ancient, unfathomable life, utterly indifferent to the tiny piece of wood on its surface. Deep beneath the keel, the shadows of giant fish glided by, drawn to the constant trail of blood trailing behind the cursed ship. The world of humans continued to live as usual, somewhere infinitely far away. But for him and his entire crew, time had stopped forever. By mid-November, the shores of Jamaica were supposed to appear on the horizon, bringing long-awaited relief to all aboard the ship. Collingwood studied the horizon intently through his spyglass, waiting to see the saving green strip of land in the ocean. One morning, the lookout shouted joyfully, pointing to a dark spot that had appeared far off on the starboard side. He began to speak nervously aloud, simply to hear a human voice in that echoing emptiness. The captain mistook this land for Hispaniola, deciding that they were still too far from their final destination. He gave the fateful order to change course, steering the ship away from Jamaica, which was actually right in front of them. This decision became the starting point of a spiral of madness that would soon engulf the entire doomed ship. He suddenly realized that the most dangerous thing at sea was not the icy cold, but the looming despair. By the time the mistake became obvious, it was already too late to change anything or attempt to turn the heavy vessel around. The ship had found itself in a zone of calm, where the wind was completely absent, and the sun mercilessly scorched all living things. The sails had turned into useless scraps of dirty cloth, incapable of moving the massive hull even an inch. He no longer counted the days that had passed. He merely frantically counted the chances that remained. The realization of the disaster slowly spread across the deck, poisoning the sailors' minds with the venom of a sticky, all-consuming fear. The water supply, intended for the short remainder of the journey, now seemed laughably small for survival in the calm trap. People began to peer with horror into the emptying barrels, realizing that death by thirst had become an absolutely real prospect. He had absolutely no idea whether his sanity would survive this looming, terrifying night. At first, no one on the crew wanted to utter the dreaded word thirst aloud, fearing they might invite inevitable disaster. The sailors tried to avoid eye contact, silently performing their routine duties on the scorching hot deck. They still naively believed that a sudden, saving squall would come and break this curse. But deep down, everyone clearly understood. The situation was rapidly and irreversibly deteriorating. The temperature in the holds had reached critical levels, turning the lives of the chained men into a living hell. The moans of the Africans dying of dehydration merged into a single, unbroken, blood-curdling rumble that penetrated through the deck planks. The stench of death had become so thick that it seemed one could cut through it with a heavy sailor's knife. Panic among the crew was spreading far faster than any deadly infection. First Mate James Kelsall tried to speak with the captain about the need for strict rationing of the remaining fresh water supplies. Collingwood stared at him with a blank, expressionless gaze, as if he were in a deep, hypnotic trance. Some of the sailors already clearly understood exactly how this forced drift under the scorching equatorial sun would end. They looked at each other in fear and saw in each other's eyes only their own reflection of terror. Discipline, which had been held together by fear of the captain, began to rapidly crumble under the weight of unbearable thirst and exhausting heat. The sailors began to gather in small groups, whispering and casting gloomy glances at the locked doors of the captain's cabin. The chain of command was cracking at the seams, giving way to primal instincts of survival at any cost. The crew began to fall apart and literally crack at the seams. The captain locked himself in his cabin, surrounded by nautical charts and insurance documents, searching for a mathematical way out of the impasse. He tried to find a logical excuse for his mistake, shifting the blame onto inaccurate instruments and poor weather conditions. None of the officers wanted to take responsibility for the fate of the dying ship anymore. The captain still maintained a calm exterior, but it was clear to everyone that it wouldn't last long. The heat did not subside even at night, turning the few hours of sleep into an exhausting delirium, full of hallucinations of cool streams. The morning brought only fresh disappointment in the form of a perfectly clear, cloudless sky and water as smooth as a mirror. They were now separated not only by the merciless oceanic desert, but also by deep inner doubt. At this critical moment, they ceased to be a united crew forever. The lower decks of the ship resembled gloomy scenes from the underworld, where moans mingled with the clanging of heavy, rusty chains. People lay pressed tightly against one another, unable even to roll over onto their other side without causing pain to their neighbor. The air was so stagnant that the sailors' oil lamps often went out from a simple lack of oxygen. They began to openly blame each other for the disaster that had befallen them. The death toll among the prisoners rose to terrifying levels. The bodies could not always be carried up to the upper deck in time. The living were forced to lie next to the dead, suffocating from the miasma and losing the last remnants of their sanity. Thirst drove them mad, forcing people to drink their own urine and lick the filthy condensation from the wooden sides. The most dangerous and unpredictable enemy on board was not the calm, but total mistrust. The sailors went down into the hold only in groups, armed with loaded pistols and long clubs for self-defense. They feared the desperation of these chained men more than the rage of their own half-mad captain. The fear of a mutiny hung in the stifling air, causing the crew to flinch at every sharp sound from below. They still clung to the blind hope of weathering this invisible storm. But the real catastrophe was that there was no physical storm, only an endless, deadly silence. The ocean had turned into a vast, gleaming lens, focusing the sun's rays directly onto the blackened deck of the stranded ship. Water supplies had dwindled so much that rations were reduced to a few pitiful sips a day. But their personal inner storm was only just beginning. Collingwood stopped sleeping, spending his nights in manic calculations of the remaining supplies and the number of mouths on board. The numbers on paper didn't add up. The water was bound to run out long before they reached the saving shore. The equation of survival demanded an immediate and radical reduction in the number of those claiming the remaining water. It was precisely at this turning point that the vaunted British discipline finally cracked. The exhausted sailors moved among the rigging with the grace of mortally wounded animals, every movement causing pain in their muscles. The skin on their faces had cracked from the salt and sun, turning into a rough, unhealing crust. Their eyes had sunken in, taking on the wild gleam of people teetering on the very edge of a deep abyss. None of the crew could be sure anymore which of them would even live to see the next dawn. Thirst began to destroy not only their bodies, but also the very fabric of human relationships aboard the ship. Conversation was reduced to a minimum. Any extra word dried out their throats and triggered agonizing coughing fits. They began instinctively conserving their words just as they conserved dirty water. Everyone on deck understood clearly. The supplies in the barrels were far from endless. The glances the sailors cast at the hold hatches gradually shifted from wary to predatory and calculating. They began to see the prisoners not merely as valuable cargo, but as a direct threat to their own physical existence. Anyone who drank their water automatically became a mortal enemy, subject to immediate elimination. Some were already coldly calculating in their minds who exactly would turn out to be the weakest link. The captain stepped out onto the deck in a dirty, unbuttoned shirt. His face was contorted by a grimace of utter nervous exhaustion. He stared for a long time at the serene expanse of the ocean, as if expecting an answer from it to his unspoken, terrifying question. The wind never came, leaving them alone with the rotting wood and the people dying below. The heavy silence between the officers and the crew became far denser and more terrifying than the wind. That night, Kelsall heard the captain talking to himself, listing the clauses of the marine insurance policy. There was no pity in this muttering, only dry legal calculation and an attempt to find a financial loophole. Out of habit, they continued to talk about rescue while sitting by the mast, but with each passing hour, they believed in it less and less sincerely.
We have to lighten the load if we want to survive this.
The captain's cabin had turned into a stifling tomb where a decision was born that would forever change the history of seafaring. Collingwood spread out the syndicate's documents before him, carefully studying the fine print of the terms for compensation. If the cargo perished a natural death from disease or thirst, the ship owners would not receive a penny from the insurers. The divided crew had by this time already begun to quietly split into warring factions. However, there was one specific clause in the contract concerning emergencies and the salvage of the vessel itself. If the captain was forced to throw part of the cargo overboard to save the ship, the insurance fully covered the losses. This legal wording became, for Collingwood's fevered mind, the only acceptable way out of the unfolding disaster. The fear of death united them in the scorching heat of the day and tore them apart in the cold of the night. The captain's math was extremely simple and terrifying in its absolute, inhuman logic. A living prisoner dying of thirst on board was a direct financial loss for the powerful Liverpool investors. A prisoner thrown into the ocean to save water turned into a guaranteed £30 sterling in insurance payout. Out of habit, they still called it a temporary delay. But in reality, it was already a dead-end, inescapable trap. Collingwood summoned Kelsall and laid out his monstrous plan with a chilling, icy calm. The first mate turned pale, realizing the scale of the crime they were being asked to commit for the sake of money and a sip of water. He tried to object, reminding him of the laws of God and man, but the captain merely sneered in response. From that very day on, the normal expedition was finally over. A brutal, primitive struggle for survival began. The captain reasonably pointed out that if they did nothing, everyone would die, both the crew and the Africans in the holds. By reducing the number of mouths to feed, they gave themselves a chance at survival and preserved profits for their ruthless employers. It was a twisted form of mercy, dictated not by compassion, but by a thirst for life and fear of financial ruin. On that day, some sailors were already mentally saying goodbye to their homes forever. News of the captain's decision quickly spread throughout the ship, eliciting a mixed and terrifying reaction from the crew. Some were horrified, others, driven mad by thirst, readily accepted this plan as the only path to salvation. Morale was crushed by the instinct for self-preservation, turning ordinary sailors into potential executioners. They still functioned mechanically as a single crew, but deep down, they were already thinking like people utterly doomed. Preparations for the mass murder took place in an eerie, surreal silence, broken only by the creaking of rigging and moans from the hold. The sailors tested the strength of their clubs and prepared heavy weights to ensure the bodies would sink to the bottom of the ocean. Each of them tried to justify himself by claiming he was merely following a direct order from his superiors. The question had long since ceased to be whether everyone would survive. The sun beat down unbearably, as if trying to burn away the last remnants of conscience in the souls of these exhausted men. Collingwood stood on the bridge, watching the preparations with the cold detachment of a butcher in a slaughterhouse. He had convinced himself that he was committing a necessary evil for the greater good, the salvation of the British ship and its crew. The question now was solely who would be the last to remain. The ocean around them remained just as still and smooth, a perfect mirror reflecting human vices. Not a single gust of wind disturbed this ominous calm. Nature seemed to have frozen in anticipation of a bloody sacrifice. Tomorrow was to be the beginning of the end, the point beyond which a return to normal life would be impossible. It was precisely that moment after which absolutely everything changed. The night before the execution was filled with heavy sighs and nightmares that woke people in a cold sweat. Kelsall stared into the darkness for a long time, realizing that tomorrow he would become an accomplice to the most terrible crime of his life. But thirst burned in his throat, drowning out the voice of his conscience and forcing him to obey the terrible order. The grim story had already begun to unfold inevitably. On November 29, 1781, the crew of the Zonga began to carry out the captain's order. The men were led out of the hold in small groups, blinded by the bright light and weakened by prolonged starvation and fever. They did not understand why they had been brought up on deck, and a faint hope for a breath of fresh air could be seen in their eyes. There was no turning back for the sailors. The sailors acted quickly and ruthlessly, trying not to look into the faces of those they were about to kill. The prisoners were led to the ship's side, their hands were bound, and before they could react, they were pushed into the calm water. On that first day, 54 people, deemed the weakest and most hopeless, were thrown overboard. Women and children disappeared beneath the water first. Their bodies could not resist the weight of their wet rags and shackles. Collingwood stood with an impassive face, methodically making notes in his dreadful ship's log. They still timidly hoped that this sacrifice would bring the wind. The ocean swallowed the victims indifferently, leaving not the slightest trace of the atrocity on its mirror-like surface. The water closed quickly over the heads of the drowning men, hiding their death throes in its impenetrable darkness. The sailors breathed heavily. Their hands trembled with tension and the realization of the irreversibility of what they had just done. But foolish hope does nothing to change the harsh reality. That evening, the crew received their increased ration of water, paid for with the lives of 54 innocent Africans. The water tasted of bitterness and blood, but the men, driven mad by thirst, drank it in greedy, convulsive gulps. At night, a deathly silence reigned on the ship, broken only by the occasional screams of those tormented by nightmares. The rest of the world was too far away, unbearably far. Kelsall sat in his cabin, clutching his head, trying to erase from his memory the sounds of bodies falling into the water. He understood that this blood would forever remain on his hands. No court could wash away this shame. But the captain was unyielding. His plan had only just begun to unfold, and there was still much work ahead. Help might come by some miracle, or it might be delayed indefinitely. The next day, the thirst returned with renewed intensity, as if nature were mocking their bloody sacrifice. The sky remained cloudless, and the sun continued to scorch the last remnants of life from the scorching wooden deck. Collingwood announced that the procedure must continue, as supplies were still catastrophically low. On that cursed day, a real deadly countdown began. This time, 42 people fell victim. Their resistance was broken by weakness and brutal blows from rifle butts. The scene repeated itself with frightening routine. A run-up to the ship's side, a shove, a brief scream, and a dull, heavy splash. The crew was now acting with greater coordination, like a mechanism programmed for the systematic destruction of living beings. This was far from the end. It was only the beginning of the real ordeal. Some of the captives, realizing what awaited them, tried to put up a desperate resistance against their tormentors. They clung to the shrouds, bit the sailors' hands, but their strength was no match in this struggle. The killings continued for several days, turning the ship into a floating slaughterhouse, lost in the absolute emptiness of the ocean. The smell of blood and fear seeped into every plank, every rope, becoming an inseparable part of the cursed ship. The ocean silently accepted its tribute, promising neither wind nor forgiveness for what had been done. Nature, in its cruelty, made absolutely no distinctions. By early December, the death toll had exceeded 100, but the water in the barrels continued to evaporate relentlessly. The crew had completely lost their human form, turning into a pack of exhausted predators ready to tear each other's throats out. Moral barriers had finally collapsed, giving way to the raw, pulsing instinct of animal survival. Everything, without exception, was decided only in the here and now. One of the most terrifying episodes occurred when a group of captives broke out of the hold onto the sun-drenched deck. They did not attack the sailors, realizing the utter futility of any struggle against armed men. Joining hands, they stepped overboard of their own accord, preferring a quick death in the water to the slow torment in the hold. A long, dark descent to the bottom awaited them, and not all of the crew would be able to make it to the end without losing their minds. This act of mass suicide shook even the most brutal members of the crew, causing a momentary stupor. Watching people voluntarily walk into the abyss was more terrifying than pushing them in with his own hands. Collingwood watched from the balcony of his cabin, his face an inscrutable stone mask. To him, it meant only one thing: even fewer mouths demanding precious fresh water. The days merged into one endless succession of heat, thirst, and monotonous splashes over the ship's side. The wooden hull of the Zonga was overgrown with thick seaweed, slowing even the faint drift created by the deep currents. The ship was slowly turning into a floating coffin, drifting at the mercy of a completely indifferent universe. The crew had stopped washing. Their bodies were covered in sores and boils from constant exposure to salt and filth. Kelsall attempted to incite a mutiny against the captain, seeing that the murders were not bringing the expected salvation, but only multiplying their sins. But the sailors were too physically and mentally exhausted to support the first mate in his belated nobility. They feared Collingwood more than God's judgment, believing that the captain was the only one who knew the way home. The mutiny was nipped in the bud, and Kelsall finally gave up. The atmosphere on board became toxic. People shied away from one another, suspecting everyone of intending to steal water. At night, the deck was lit only by the dim light of the stars, in which the shadows of the rigging looked like gallows. The silence was broken only by the delirium of those dying of fever and the lapping of water against the ship's rotting sides. Everyone understood that if the wind did not pick up in the coming days, they would all follow the Africans who had been thrown overboard. Collingwood continued to keep his records, noting every piece of cargo thrown overboard with the pedantry of a mad accountant. He had long since crossed the line where man ends and a calculating monster begins. In his fevered mind, numbers had replaced reality, and insurance pounds had become more important than human souls. He sat in the darkness of his cabin, listening to his first and last ship slowly die. The number of captives had been reduced by nearly a third, but this brought no relief to the exhausted crew. The heat continued to parch their bodies, turning their muscles into dried-out straps clinging to protruding bones. The sailors' eyes had sunk so deep that they looked like nothing more than black holes in skin-covered skulls. The ocean remained silent, ignoring their desperate, wordless pleas for salvation. One morning, a small dark cloud appeared on the horizon, sparking a faint murmur of hope among the crew. The men poured out onto the deck, lifting their faces to the sky and greedily gulping down the hot, still air. But the cloud passed by without dropping a single drop of precious moisture onto the scorching deck planks. It was yet another cruel mockery of nature, testing the limits of human endurance. Despair reached its absolute peak when the sailors realized that even the heavens had turned their backs on them. They sat on the deck in complete numbness, awaiting the end, which now seemed inevitable and even welcome. The ship continued to drift aimlessly, carrying in its bowels the dead and those who envied the dead. The trap had snapped shut for good, leaving not the slightest hope for a miraculous deliverance. The next few days merged into a single exhausting nightmare, where reality mingled with cruel, feverish visions. The sailors lay in the shadow of the masts, their breathing ragged and wheezing, like that of hounded dogs. There was exactly 2 days' worth of water left, if rationed at half a teaspoon per person. The practice of throwing people overboard had ceased, as the crew simply no longer had the strength to haul the bodies. Collingwood hardly ever left his cabin. His mind had finally plunged into an abyss of paranoid calculations and fears. He muttered excuses before an invisible tribunal, justifying his monstrous actions by maritime law. His uniform was stained with food and sweat, his hair tangled into filthy mats that hid his mad gaze. The great captain had become a pitiful prisoner of his own ambitions and unforgivable mistakes. Kelsall assumed de facto command of the remnants of the crew, though there was practically no one left to command. He rationed the last drops of water with a jeweler's precision, knowing that every drop meant several more hours of life. The glances the sailors exchanged had grown empty. Even malice and animal fear had vanished from them. All that remained was an endless, dull weariness from pain and the unbearable anticipation of the outcome. Absolute silence reigned in the holds. The surviving Africans were in a deep coma from dehydration. Their bodies resembled skeletons covered in skin. Their breathing was barely discernible in the dim light of the stifling, foul-smelling room. The stench of decay permeated the entire ship, becoming its inseparable, clinging, and nauseating aura. The Zong had become a ghost ship even before its crew had physically left this world. At night, the ocean phosphoresced, creating the illusion that the ship was sailing across a surface of glowing, cold fire. This mesmerizing spectacle seemed like a mockery of the men, slowly burning from the internal heat of tropical fever. The stars in the black sky were huge and cold. They looked on indifferently at the agony of the little wooden shell. No prayers could pierce through this thick veil of cosmic indifference. In the morning, one of the sailors tried to drink seawater, unable to endure the thirst tearing at his insides any longer. Kelsall struck his hands, knowing that the salt water would bring only swift madness and a painful death. The sailor wept dry tears, his chest heaving convulsively in silent, agonizing sobs. Physical pain had long since receded into the background, giving way to total psychological breakdown. The ship's wood began to emit strange cracking sounds, as if drying out under the relentless heat of the scorching sun. The deck was covered with deep cracks, from which oozed molten black resin that stuck to bare feet. The rigging and shrouds sagged, having lost their elasticity, turning into the useless web of a dead giant spider. Time stood still, frozen in this stifling, sticky substance of the ocean's calm. The sun was slowly sinking toward the horizon, painting the ocean in blood-red hues reminiscent of the crimes committed. The shadows on the deck lengthened, creating bizarre silhouettes resembling distorted human hands reaching up from the abyss. It was yet another day lived that had brought nothing but additional suffering and weakness. Hope for salvation had died, leaving behind only the bitter taste of ashes on parched lips. Kelsall looked at the empty water barrel and realized that tomorrow they would have nothing to drink at all. This was the end, the mathematical limit of their survival, the point of no return beyond which lay only death. He closed his eyes and whispered a short prayer, asking not for salvation, but for a quick and painless end. The ocean listened in silence, preparing to embrace the final victims of this cursed voyage. On the night when the last drops of water had been distributed, the sky above the ocean suddenly darkened, hiding the bright stars. The air grew thick and humid, and a light, cool breeze touched the flushed faces of the sailors dying on the deck. At first, no one believed their senses, mistaking this saving coolness for yet another cruel hallucination. But the wind grew stronger, causing the sagging, dirty sails to flap quietly in the surrounding, tense darkness. The first heavy raindrops fell onto the scorching deck with a sound like a drum roll. The sailors began to slowly rise, stretching their trembling, ulcer-covered hands toward the saving dark sky. The rain intensified, turning into a heavy tropical downpour that washed the dirt, salt, and despair from the wooden planks. People opened their mouths, catching the heavenly moisture, which seemed to them sweeter than the most expensive aged wine. Collingwood burst out of the cabin, holding his frenzied face under the streams of icy, life-giving water. He laughed and cried at the same time, convinced that the heavens had sent him a sign of complete forgiveness for what he had done. Kelsall and the sailors frantically spread out pieces of sailcloth to collect as much fresh water as possible into the empty barrels. It was a true miracle, a resurrection from the dead at the very last, critical moment of their existence. The rain fell for several hours, filling the containers with enough water to last until they reached land. The wind did not die down either. It filled the sails, and the heavy ship finally broke free from its deadlock. The ocean, which just yesterday had seemed a merciless executioner, today gave them life and a path to their long-awaited salvation. But the price paid for this miracle was too high for anyone to rejoice sincerely. The realization that the rain had started just a few days after the mass killings struck Kelsall like a bolt of lightning. If Collingwood had waited, if he hadn't panicked, 130 people would still be alive. This thought poisoned the taste of the fresh water, turning the joy of salvation into an unbearable, suffocating torment of conscience. They had survived, but they had ceased to be human forever, having turned into monsters saved by blind chance. For the Africans locked in the holds, this rain came too late. Many of them could no longer drink. Their emaciated bodies rejected the water, and they died right in the arms of the sailors trying to give them a drink. The captain forebode wasting the collected water on those who, in his opinion, would not survive the journey to Jamaica anyway. This decision confirmed that his cruelty was dictated not only by fear, but also by utter indifference. The wind drove the ship steadily westward, bringing the end of this protracted descent into hell closer. The crew slowly came to their senses. Strength returned to their exhausted bodies, but their minds remained forever scarred. They tried not to speak of what had happened during the calm, having made an unspoken pact of silence. But every night, the screams of the men thrown overboard continued to echo in their fevered minds. Collingwood locked himself in his cabin, rewriting the ship's log in fair copy, carefully choosing his legal phrasing. He described the acute shortage of water and the threat of mutiny, creating the perfect picture for the London insurers. In his version of events, the mass murder appeared as a heroic act by the captain, saving the ship and the crew. The lies flowed onto the paper in neat lines, concealing rivers of innocently spilled blood beneath them. The ocean behind the stern remained calm. It concealed all traces of the crime in its bottomless, dark depths. Nature had no intention of judging these people. It simply allowed them to survive, leaving judgment to human justice. But Kelsall knew that the true judgment had already taken place there, in the zone of the dead equatorial calms. And each of the survivors would carry the verdict of that terrible judgment within themselves for the rest of their days. The shores of Jamaica appeared on the horizon exactly 1 week later, a green strip of hope in the blue sea. The Zong slowly entered the harbor, battered, filthy, with a crew of living dead on board. They had reached their destination. They had brought the remains of their cargo and saved their worthless lives. But the ship that had left the shores of Africa had vanished forever into the silence of the cursed ocean. The port of Kingston greeted the Zong with its usual bustle, the clatter of port cranes, and the shouts of local merchants. When the ship docked, port officials who boarded it recoiled in horror at the smell and sight of the crew. Of the more than 400 Africans, just over 200 had survived, and they resembled walking skeletons. The crew also looked emaciated. Their eyes darted about, avoiding direct eye contact with the authorities. Collingwood went ashore with a folder of documents. His gait was unsteady, but his face retained an arrogant expression. He immediately went to the ship owner's representative's office to file a claim for the loss of part of the valuable cargo. There was no room for emotion in his account, only dry facts about the water shortage and the measures they had been forced to take. The accountants listened intently, clicking their abacus beads and converting human lives into ringing gold guineas. The claim for an insurance payout of £30 for each slave thrown overboard was officially filed. The Gregson Syndicate, which owned the ship, asked no unnecessary questions. They were interested only in the financial aspect of this tragedy. A human life in this system was worth exactly what the insurers were willing to pay for it. The murder of more than 130 people was cynically classified as a routine commercial loss of goods. However, rumors of what had happened aboard the Zonga quickly spread through the port taverns and narrow streets of Kingston. Sailors drunk on cheap rum rambled in their delirium about screams in the night and people thrown into the calm ocean. This information reached the abolitionists, people fighting for the complete abolition of the shameful slave trade in the British Empire. What the ship owners had tried to hide behind dry figures began to gradually take the shape of a national scandal. The insurance company, sensing something was amiss and unwilling to part with the money, refused to pay the required compensation. The case went to a London court, where the ship owners filed a lawsuit against the insurers, demanding compensation for losses under the contract. It was this cynical trial that lifted the veil of secrecy from what had actually happened out at sea. It was not the murderers who sat in the dock, but the insurers refusing to pay for the murder that had been committed. Kelsall was summoned to court as a witness. His testimony became key to revealing the details of the bloody massacre. He spoke of the calm, of the thirst, of the captain's order. His voice trembled and his hands nervously crumpled his hat. The public was shocked not so much by the fact of the murder itself as by the fact that it was being discussed in the context of an insurance dispute. People realized that the slave trade system had turned human life into mere expendable material. In his ruling, Lord Mansfield ruled that the case should be considered exclusively within the framework of property law. He stated that, from a legal standpoint, the death of slaves was no different from the forced jettisoning of horses at sea. This cold, strictly legal ruling sparked a storm of outrage among the progressive segment of British society. The Zong scandal became a powerful catalyst for the growing movement to abolish slavery. Luke Collingwood did not live to see the end of the legal proceedings. His health, already weakened by the journey, rapidly deteriorated. He died in his bed, never having answered for the deaths of 130 people before a human court. Until the very end, his mind clung to the clauses of the insurance contract, trying to find in them a justification for his cruelty. He passed away, leaving behind only a bloody stain on maritime history. The Zong case did not result in criminal punishment for the crew. None of them were hanged for the mass murder they had committed. The law of that time protected property, not the lives of those who were officially recognized as that property. But this trial broke a huge hole in the wall of silence and indifference surrounding the slave trade. Britain was horrified by its own reflection in the mirror of this brutal trial. The ocean continued to roll its waves, indifferent to the courts, the laws, and the human suffering on its shores. It claimed its victim, kept it secret, and remained an uninvolved witness to one of the darkest chapters in history. The surviving sailors, until the end of their days, would wake up at night to the sound of rain that always came too late. The ocean did not kill them on purpose. It simply waited, coldly and patiently.